There is a sound that no kitchen makes anymore. It started before the sun came up, before the birds, before anything. It was a low, steady rhythm, the sound of a cast-iron pot being set on a gas burner that clicked 3 times before it caught. The sound of a woman who had already been up an hour before anyone else in the house, standing in a kitchen barely bigger than a closet, doing what she had always done. Making something out of nothing. Making enough out of not enough. If you grew up in a black household in the 1950s or the 1960s, if you were blessed enough to have a big mama in your life, or a grandmother who wore an apron like a second skin, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know that her kitchen smelled like butter browning in a pan and bay leaves floating in something deep and rich on the back burner. You know that she could walk into a nearly empty refrigerator on a Wednesday and walk out with dinner. Not just dinner. A meal. A real meal. The kind that made grown men go quiet at the table. Those women knew things. They knew things about food and money and feeding a family that nobody ever wrote down in a cookbook. They learned it from their mothers who learned it from their mothers, all the way back through time. They didn't call it meal planning. They didn't call it budgeting. They just called it Tuesday. And somewhere along the way, we lost it. We traded it in for convenience and forgot what it cost us. That's what we're going here today. We're going back into Big Mama's kitchen, and we are not leaving until we've remembered every last trick she had up her sleeve. Hey family, I'm James, and today we're going way back into those tight-knit black households of the American South and the northern cities during the 1950s, 1960s, and into the early 1970s, when Big Mama ran that kitchen like a general runs a war room. We're talking about 25 forgotten tricks, real, practical, beautiful tricks that stretched $1 from Monday all the way to Friday. These weren't just cooking tips. They were survival genius dressed up in love. Now before we get into it, if this is your first time here with us, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is for the folks who remember, and for the children and grandchildren who want to understand where they came from. We're building something real here. So go on, subscribe, ring that bell so you don't miss a thing, and let's get into Big Mama's kitchen. Number 1, the pot licker save. Now, if you don't know what pot licker is, I need you to stop everything and pay attention, because this right here is the foundation of everything Big Mama knew about not wasting a single thing. Pot licker, some folks spelled it liquor, was the dark, rich, deeply flavored liquid left in the bottom of the pot after you cooked collard greens, mustard greens, or turnip greens down low and slow. Most people today would pour that liquid right down the drain. Lord have mercy. Big Mama would have looked at you like you had lost your entire mind. That pot liquor was gold. It had absorbed everything the greens had to give, the salt pork or smoked ham hock she'd dropped in at the beginning, the natural sweetness of the greens themselves, the slow heat of a whole afternoon of cooking. She'd save every drop of it. And then she'd do one of 3 things. She'd use it as a broth base for the next day's bean soup, adding nothing but dried pinto beans and an onion and letting it go. Or she'd heat it up in a shallow bowl and let the children dunk their cornbread in it, which wasn't just delicious. It was nutrition. Iron. Vitamins. Everything those greens had pulled out of the earth. Or she'd use it to cook the next batch of dried field peas, which gave them a depth of flavor that no store-bought broth could touch. Back in those days, nothing left that kitchen with any life still in it. Nothing. Number 2, the bone stock protocol. Every meat bone that came through Big Mama's kitchen had a second life. Ham bones, neck bones, chicken backs and feet, even the tiny T-bones from pork chops. After the Sunday meal was done, and the plates were cleared, and the family had gone to sit in the living room, Big Mama was in that kitchen filling a pot with water and every bone that had anything left on it. She'd add whatever she had, an onion cut in half, some celery tops that most folks threw away, a bay leaf or 2 from that jar she kept on the shelf next to the salt. She'd let it go on a low flame overnight sometimes, or at least for 2 or 3 hours. And what she pulled out of that pot the next morning was a stock so rich, so dark, so full of body, that it became the base of the next 3 meals. Bean soup on Monday, Rice cooked in stock instead of water on Tuesday, which made that plain white rice taste like something from a fine dining establishment. Gravy on Wednesday, made from nothing but that stock, a little flour browned in the same cast-iron pan she'd cooked the Sunday pork in, and some black pepper. Child, let me tell you something. That was food science happening in a 3-room house in Alabama. That was genius in an apron. Number 3, the dry bean rotation. Big Mama kept dried beans the way a bank keeps money. She had them in mason jars lined up on a shelf. Pintos, navy beans, black-eyed peas, red kidney beans, Great Northerns. And she rotated through them deliberately, not randomly, so that the family never got tired of any one kind. She understood something that nutritionists would spend decades writing papers about, that dried beans, when combined with rice or cornbread, gave you complete protein. She didn't know the science. She knew the result. Everybody in the house was full and strong, and nobody complained they were hungry at 10 o'clock at night. The trick wasn't just in the rotation, it was in the soak. She put those beans in water the night before, always the night before, and let them soak through the dark hours, which pulled out the compounds that made some people gassy and also cut the cooking time in half. That was important because cooking time meant gas or wood burning, and burning fuel cost money. Everything was connected. She thought in systems without ever using that word. Number 4, the fat jar. Right there on Big Mama's stove, or sometimes on the counter next to it, there was a tin can or a ceramic jar. Sometimes it was a coffee can. Sometimes it was an old jam jar. And that jar held what we now call rendered fat, but what she just called drippings. Every time she fried bacon, the drippings went in the jar. Every time she cooked salt pork, the fat went in the jar. Chicken skin, ham fat, all of it went in that jar. And that jar was the flavor foundation of the entire week's cooking. A spoonful of those drippings in the cast iron before scrambling the eggs. A spoonful to start the roux for gravy. A spoonful to grease the cornbread pan so the bottom crust came out that deep golden color that made you want to break off a piece before you even got it to the table. It was never wasted. It was never thrown out unless it went bad, and she could tell by smell alone when it had. Folks don't do this anymore, and that's a shame. You can buy all the fancy cooking oils in the world, and nothing gives food the depth of flavor that a well-kept fat jar can give. Number 5, the stale bread system. There was no such thing as throwing away bread in Big Mama's kitchen. None. A loaf of white bread that had gone stale by Wednesday became one of 3 things. It became bread pudding on Thursday, one of the most beloved desserts in all of Southern cooking, made from nothing but old bread, eggs, milk, sugar, a little nutmeg and vanilla, and whatever dried fruit or raisins she had on hand. Or it became stuffing for a whole chicken, seasoned with sage and onion and celery, packed into that bird and baked until it had absorbed every drop of the chicken's juices. Or she dried it out completely in the oven on a low heat, crumbled it fine, and kept the breadcrumbs in a bag to coat fried things, fish, green tomatoes, pork cutlets, later in the week. Nothing went stale in her kitchen. Things just changed their purpose. Number 6, the fatback foundation. Now, some of you know what fatback is, and some of you have been living a sheltered life. Fatback is a cut of pork, specifically the fat from the back of the pig. That was one of the most economical and widely used ingredients in Southern black cooking from the earliest days all the way through the 1970s. It was cheap. It was available. And in the hands of a woman who knew what she was doing, it was transformative. Big Mama used fatback the way a painter uses a base coat. She'd cube it up and render it in the pot first, letting the fat melt out of it slowly over a medium flame until the little cubes of meat left over, what we called cracklins, turned golden and crisp. Then she'd cook her greens in that fat, her beans, her cabbage, her dried field peas. Whatever vegetable needed a reason to be eaten, fatback gave it one. For a family of 7 or 8 living on a working man's wages in the mid-1950s, a pound of fatback bought for pennies at the butcher shop could season an entire week of vegetables. That was just how it was done. Number 7. The vegetable top principle. Now I want you to think about what you throw away when you bring vegetables home from the store. The tops of carrots, the outer leaves of cabbage, the stems of collard greens, the seeds and the soft core of a watermelon, the skin of onions. Big Mama threw away none of it, not one piece. Carrot tops went into the stock pot. The tough outer leaves of cabbage, the ones you'd normally peel off and discard, got stuffed with a small amount of seasoned ground meat or rice and simmered in tomato sauce, making a dish that stretched a 1/4 pound of ground beef into dinner for a family of 6. The stems of collard greens, which are perfectly edible and actually more flavorful than the leaves, got chopped fine and added to stews. Watermelon rinds, the white part most people cut away, got pickled in vinegar and sugar and spice and put up in jars, and those pickled watermelon rinds sat on the table as a condiment alongside pork for months. She looked at a vegetable and saw its entirety, every part with a use, every part with a purpose. Now before we keep going, family, I need to stop and ask you something. What is the one thing your grandmother made in her kitchen that you have never been able to figure out how she did it with so little? What was the dish she pulled off on a Wednesday night with almost nothing in the house, and it tasted like a Sunday meal? Drop it in the comments. Tell me the dish. Tell me the state she was from if you know it. I read every single comment, and I guarantee somebody out there's Big Mama made it the same way. Let's keep that knowledge alive in these comments. Now let's keep going. Number 8. The Sunday Chicken All-Week Plan. This one right here was architecture. Real, deliberate planning disguised as cooking. Big Mama bought one whole chicken, or sometimes raised one herself in a yard pen out back. And that one bird fed the family not once, not twice, but 4 times across a week. Sunday. Roasted whole, which was the main Sunday meal. The best pieces, the breast, the thighs, went to the working adults and the children. Monday. Any remaining meat picked clean off the bone went into a pot pie, which was nothing more than the leftover chicken mixed with leftover vegetables and whatever broth remained, poured into a pan lined with a simple flour and lard crust. Tuesday. The carcass and all the bones went into the stock pot I told you about in number 2. Wednesday. That chicken stock became the base for a pot of rice or a simple soup with whatever garden vegetables she had. My granddaddy worked 6 days a week and never once complained, and part of the reason that man never went hungry was because Big Mama could make one chicken last longer than a month of Sundays. Number 9. The flour sack principle. Child, let me tell you something about flour sacks. In the 1940s and 1950s, flour companies began selling their product in cotton muslin bags printed with patterns, flowers, plaids, small geometric prints. They did this because they knew. They knew that black women and poor rural women of every background were washing those sacks and sewing them into clothing, quilts, curtains, and dish towels. They weren't being charitable. They were being smart. And Big Mama was smarter. She kept every flour sack, every sugar sack, every grain sack. The plain cotton ones became dishcloths and cleaning rags that replaced paper towels, which she would never spend money on. The printed ones became aprons, pillowcases, blouses for the girls, patches for the boys' trousers. Nothing you paid money for got thrown away simply because its original purpose was used up. The container was part of the purchase. She thought like that. Everything had a second chapter. Number 10. The cold weather root cellar. Now, not every family had a root cellar, but many of the families in rural areas, in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, the Carolinas, had some version of it. A cool, dark place below the ground or dug into a hillside where the temperature stayed low and steady, and Big Mama filled it every fall without fail. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, turnips, dried beans in sealed jars, canned tomatoes she'd put up in the heat of August when they were cheap and abundant, canned peaches from the tree in the yard, sorghum molasses in sealed crocks. That root cellar was a savings account. It was the difference between being able to feed your children in February and having to depend on someone else to do it. She built her food security into the earth itself. You won't see that today. But I promise you, if those women could see what we spend at the grocery store in February buying things they had already stored by October, they would shake their heads and say not a word, because they had already said it, with their hands. Number 11. The milk stretch. Back in those days, fresh milk was a daily expense that added up fast for a large family. Big Mama knew how to make it go further. Evaporated milk from a can was the answer. It was cheaper per serving than fresh, lasted on the shelf without refrigeration until opened, and when diluted with an equal part of water, performed nearly identically to fresh milk in cooking. She used it in cornbread batter, in mashed potatoes, in biscuit dough, in the custard base for bread pudding. She kept a stack of evaporated milk cans in the cabinet, the way some people keep a pantry stocked now. But the real stretch trick was with powdered milk, which became widely available in the 1950s. She mixed it according to the directions and used it freely for cooking, saving the precious fresh milk, if there was any, for the children to drink straight, and for making butter, if she kept a churn. Waste was a luxury she could not afford, so waste simply did not exist. Number 12. The cornmeal everything rule. If flour was Big Mama's canvas, cornmeal was her ink. A 5-pound bag of cornmeal in her kitchen was not one ingredient. It was an entire week of side dishes waiting to happen. Monday, cornbread in the cast iron, baked crisp on the outside and tender inside, eaten alongside beans. Tuesday, cornmeal mush, what some people called grits, cooked thick and slow with just water and salt, served with butter or poured into a pan to cool, then sliced and fried the next morning in the fat jar drippings until golden and crisp on both sides. Wednesday, hush puppies dropped by the spoonful into hot oil to go alongside whatever fish the men had brought back from the creek. Thursday, cornmeal used as a dredge for frying okra, green tomatoes, or thin-cut pork chops. 5 pounds of cornmeal, $1 or less at the store in 1960, fed a family of 8 for a week of side dishes. That was just how it was done. Number 13. The garden integration. Almost every family that I knew of growing up, if they had any ground at all, even a narrow strip beside the house, had a kitchen garden. Collards, mustard greens, turnips, sweet potatoes, snap beans, butter beans, tomatoes in the summer, okra, hot peppers. These weren't grown for pleasure. They were grown for survival math. The difference between a $10 week at the grocery store and a $4 week was that garden. Big Mama knew what to plant and when. She knew to plant collards in early fall because they came in sweet after the first frost. She knew to leave some of the okra on the stalk until it was too tough to eat, then let it dry and save the seeds for next year, so she never had to buy them again. She knew to let the sweet potatoes cure for 2 weeks after pulling them from the ground, so they'd keep longer and taste sweeter. She was a farmer and a cook in the same body. Number 14. The syrup jar rinse. Now this one right here is so small it might make you smile, but it matters. When Big Mama finished a jar of sorghum molasses or Caro corn syrup, which cost real money and was used sparingly, she did not throw that jar away. She poured a small amount of hot water into it, sealed it, and shook it until every last trace of syrup had dissolved into the water. Then she poured that sweetened water into whatever she was baking, into the cake batter, into the sweet potato filling, into the cornbread when she wanted it a little sweeter. It was maybe a tablespoon of syrup's worth, but it was a tablespoon that had already been paid for, and she was not in the habit of leaving paid-for things in a jar headed for the trash. Every jar, every time. Small habits, practiced for a lifetime, compound into something extraordinary. Number 15. The second-day soup rule. Every Sunday, after the big dinner was done, Big Mama began the calculation. What was left? What had not been touched or barely touched? What could be combined tomorrow? Because Sunday dinner leftovers were never plated and reheated for Monday. That was not how it worked. They were transformed. The leftover beans were mashed slightly with a fork and thinned with the pot liquor she'd saved, and became a thick, creamy bean soup that was better than the original dish. The leftover rice became the base for a soup when combined with the bone stock and whatever vegetables she had. The 2 or 3 pieces of fried chicken that nobody had gotten to became cold fried chicken sandwiches on Monday, wrapped in wax paper and packed in the lunch pails the men took to work. Nothing sat in a bowl in the icebox waiting to be eaten the same way it had appeared the night before. She thought in transformations, not in leftovers. That is a different way of thinking entirely. Number 16. The hog parts hierarchy. In the rural South, when a hog was slaughtered, typically in the late fall when the weather turned cold enough to keep the meat, nothing was discarded. Nothing. Big Mama's family, and families like hers, used every single part of that animal. The hams and shoulders were smoked and salted for keeping through the winter. The belly became bacon. The feet were pickled in brine and vinegar and became a delicacy eaten at room temperature. The ears were boiled with vinegar and spices and sliced thin. The intestines were cleaned with exhaustive care and became chitterlings, which when properly cooked, and there is no shortcut to cooking them properly, produced a dish that sent grown men back to the table a second and a third time. The liver was fried the same day the hog was slaughtered because it didn't keep. The blood was used for blood pudding. The fat was rendered for lard. The head was simmered for hours to make a pressed meat called souse, which was seasoned with vinegar and pepper and allowed to cool in a pan until it set firm, then sliced and served as a cold cut. My granddaddy worked 6 days a week and never once complained. And this was part of why. The women in his life had ensured that not a single resource was abandoned. The hog was not a meal. It was a season. Number 17. The sourdough starter keeping. Before store-bought yeast packets existed as a standard household item, and even for many years after they did because buying them was an additional expense, Big Mama maintained a sourdough starter. Just flour and water and thyme, left in a warm place to capture the wild yeast that existed naturally in her kitchen. She named it sometimes. She talked to it. She fed it flour and water every few days without fail. That starter meant she never needed to buy yeast to make bread. She baked a plain loaf once or twice a week. Nothing fancy, just flour, water, salt, starter, and the patience to let it rise. And that bread served as the backbone of the family's eating throughout the week, alongside beans to soak up the pot liquor, spread with a thin coat of whatever fat was available, toasted in the oven until hard, and eaten with coffee for breakfast. Folks don't do this anymore, and that's a shame. A sourdough starter, properly maintained, costs nothing after the initial flour and water. It can theoretically be kept alive indefinitely. There are starters being used today that are 100 years old, passed from mother to daughter to granddaughter without interruption. Number 18. The icebox planning. Before the electric refrigerator became a standard fixture in black households in the 1950s and into the early 1960s for many rural families, Big Mama worked with an icebox, an actual icebox. A wooden or metal insulated cabinet where you put a block of ice that the iceman delivered, and the cold it created lasted only a few days before the ice melted down and needed replacing. The ice cost money, which meant refrigerated storage was a rationed resource. She planned her week's cooking around that ice. The things that needed the most cold, raw meat, fresh milk, certain cooked foods, went in first and were used first before the ice diminished. The things that could be stored at room temperature, root vegetables, dried goods, the fat jar, the sourdough starter, certain pickled items, never went near the icebox at all. She kept a mental ledger of what needed cold, what needed cool, what needed nothing. And she worked that ledger every single day without writing it down once. That was just how it was done. Number 19. The pork rind advantage. When Big Mama fried salt pork or fatback, and the small pieces of meat left behind, the cracklins, came out of the fat golden and crisp, she did not eat them all immediately, tempting as they were. She stored them in a cloth-covered bowl at room temperature and deployed them throughout the week as a flavoring agent. Cracklins crumbled over beans. Cracklins stirred into cornbread batter, which gave the bread a savory, porky crunch that made people fight over the edges. Cracklins scattered over a bowl of pinto beans like garnish. The fat they left behind when you pressed them against a piece of bread was itself a condiment. You could buy pork rinds commercially by the late 1950s, but Big Mama made her own from what would otherwise have been discarded, and hers were better. They always were. Number 20. The coffee extension trick. Coffee was a daily necessity in most black households of that era, but it was an expense that had to be managed. Big Mama had a rule. Used coffee grounds were not discarded after the first brew. She'd brew a full pot in the morning, a percolator, always a percolator, sitting on that back burner through the morning, and when the pot was gone, she'd add a small amount of fresh grounds to the used ones already in the basket, and brew a second, lighter pot for the afternoon. The second pot was weaker. She knew this, but mixed in equal parts with the first pot's remains in a thermos, it became a passable, full-strength cup. Or she'd use the second, lighter brew as the liquid base in chocolate cake batter, which deepened the chocolate flavor without being detectable as coffee. Or she'd let it cool and use it to water the African violet she kept on the kitchen windowsill, because she'd heard, correctly as it turns out, that coffee grounds were good for the soil. Nothing was wasted, not even the morning ritual. Number 21. The canning season calendar. Every summer, starting around late June and running through September, Big Mama went into a kind of controlled intensity. This was canning season. Whatever the garden produced beyond what the family could eat fresh got preserved. Tomatoes in August, when they were at peak and overabundant and cost almost nothing at the farm stand. Green beans in July, sealed in mason jars with nothing but water and salt and processed in a pot of boiling water until safe. Peaches from the tree in the yard, preserved in a light syrup that meant there would be peach cobbler in December. She kept those jars on shelves in the root cellar, organized and dated. Not in writing, she kept the dates in her head. And she rotated through them across the winter months the way a conductor moves through a symphony. The canned tomatoes became the base of January soups. The green beans appeared on the table in February, as if it were still summer. The peaches arrived on a cold March evening as a reminder that warmth had existed and would come again. This was not simply cooking. This was an act of faith in the future, an investment made in the heat of summer for the cold of winter. This right here is something we need to bring back. Number 22. The egg economy. Families that kept chickens, and many did, even in small towns where a few hens in a backyard pen was still common in the 1950s, had eggs as a renewable resource. But even those who bought eggs from a neighbor or the market understood their layered economy. Eggs were not just breakfast. They were a binder, a thickener, a protein stretcher, a leavener, and an entire meal in their own right. Big Mama rationed them. Scrambled eggs for a family of 6 used 3 eggs and a splash of the evaporated milk, extended with diced leftover potatoes or onions or whatever else was there. 1 egg beaten into a biscuit dough extended to 12 biscuits. An egg wash brushed on the top of a pie crust used less than 1/4 of an egg, and the rest went into the batter for something else. She knew the exact weight and function of every egg in that house, and she deployed them with the precision of a woman who had learned the hard way that abundance was temporary and planning was permanent. Number 23. The sweet potato utility. Of all the ingredients in Big Mama's kitchen, the sweet potato might have been the most versatile in terms of how many forms it could take on. Boiled and mashed with butter and a little nutmeg for a side dish. Sliced thick and baked alongside a pork roast, absorbing the drippings until they were candied at the edges and soft all the way through. Cubed and simmered in a pot with a little sugar and cinnamon and the syrup jar rinse trick from earlier until they became what she called candied yams, which was not actually a yam, but nobody cared because the result was magnificent. And then there was sweet potato pie, which was Big Mama's answer to dessert in a household where buying the ingredients for a proper fruit pie was sometimes beyond the week's budget. The sweet potatoes came from the garden at no additional cost. The eggs, 1 or 2. The evaporated milk, a partial can. The spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, vanilla, had been bought in the large bulk containers that lasted all season. The lard crust came from the rendered fat already in the house. The whole pie cost cents. And it tasted. It tasted like something you would pay serious money for today. Child, let me tell you something. Everything you need to make a sweet potato pie from scratch, you can purchase today for less than $4. Big Mama was making it for a fraction of that in 1961. It is on you to bring it back. Number 24. The Neighborhood Exchange Network. Now, this one is not a cooking trick exactly. It is something larger. It is an economic system that Big Mama participated in without ever calling it an economic system. Every woman on the block knew what every other woman grew, canned, cooked well, or made to order. Mrs. Henderson, 2 doors down, kept a fig tree. Big Mama had the best tomatoes on the street. The woman on the corner raised rabbits. The deaconess at the church made the best cane syrup in the county. And they traded. Constantly. Quietly. Without any formal arrangement. A jar of Big Mama's canned tomatoes went to Mrs. Henderson in exchange for a quart of fig preserves. The rabbit came to Big Mama's kitchen at a discount in exchange for a jar of her pickled watermelon rinds. The deaconess got vegetables in exchange for a bottle of syrup. Nobody went without because nobody hoarded. The whole block would smell something good on Sunday morning coming from 3 or 4 different kitchens at once, and there was always enough because the women had organized it that way. The whole block would smell it on Sunday morning. That is gone now, family. That neighborhood knowledge network. That community of women who fed each other's families quietly and without drama. We lost it when we stopped talking to our neighbors and started driving past them without making eye contact. That is a real loss. That is something we genuinely need to bring back. Number 25. The teaching hands. And then there's this last one. The one that made all the other 24 possible in the next generation, and the one after that. Big Mama did not cook alone. She was never alone in that kitchen if there was a child in the house old enough to stand on a stool and reach the counter. From the time a girl in the family could walk without falling, she was in that kitchen beside her grandmother, watching. Not being handed a child's task to keep her occupied. Watching. Paying attention. Learning what every sound meant. When the oil in the cast iron was hot enough to fry, when the bread dough had been kneaded long enough, when the beans needed more water, when the greens were done. By the time a girl in that household was 12 years old, she could cook a full meal from beginning to end with what was available in the kitchen, adapt if something was missing, and feed the family. That was not an accident. That was an education, delivered daily over the course of years, transmitted hand to hand and through the steam rising from every pot. Big Mama was not just cooking food. She was building the next generation of women who would be able to do what she did. She was ensuring continuity. She understood that the knowledge in her hands would not transmit itself, that it had to be deliberately given over and over with patience and repetition until it lived in somebody else's hands the way it lived in hers. And here is the truth that I want to leave with you today, family. Every trick in this video, every one of those 24 other methods of stretching and saving and making something beautiful out of almost nothing, every single one of them only exists in our memory today because some woman, somewhere, was patient enough to teach it to someone standing beside her at a stove. The knowledge did not survive in books. It did not survive in recipe cards. It survived in hands. In daughters standing beside mothers, in granddaughters standing beside Big Mamas, and when we stopped standing beside each other, when we told our children to go watch television while we handled the kitchen, when convenience food made it possible to skip the teaching entirely, that is when the knowledge began to die. Now Big Mama, she used to say, and I can hear her voice right now as clearly as if she were standing in this very room. She used to say that a woman who can cook from nothing is a woman who is never truly poor. She meant it as practical advice, but it was also a philosophy. It was a way of understanding what real wealth looks like. It is not what is in the bank, it is what is in the hands, what is in the knowledge, what is in the ability to walk into a kitchen that is almost empty and walk out an hour later with a table that is full. We didn't have much family, but we had everything that mattered. And I hope today, just a little bit, we brought some of that back. I'll see you next time, family.